Have you ever truly listened to silence? Not the absence of sound, but the silence that holds the ghost of what came before, a silence so dense it threatens to suffocate you with memory. It is the silence that follows the final, echoing blast. And have you ever had to choose which sound was more real? The thunder of 1,000 lies you were taught to believe, the relentless, mechanical clamor of ideology, or the fragile, terrifying whisper of one single, inconvenient truth? I am old now. The mirror shows me a landscape of etched lines, a topography of survival. My hands, though quick and certain no longer, still remember the rhythm. They remember the Rheinmetall-Borsig plant, the industrial heart of steel and fire in Dusseldorf. Before the war consumed us all, before the world became a continuous spectacle of fire and dust, my life was defined by absolute precision. I was a loader, a simple, vital, and utterly unforgiving task, taking the raw, gray, explosive charge, the volatile, eager heart of the shell, and placing it perfectly into its brass casing. It was a science of destruction, clean and ordered. Every shell, every charge had to be identical. Any variance, any trembling hand meant death, my own, or the failure of the line, which was a death of a different kind. My world was one of measurable, predictable consequence. You put A into B, and the result was C. The defense of the fatherland, the preservation of the order. I believed in those clean lines with the fervent desperation of a drowning woman clinging to a spar. I believed in the necessary cruelty of the machine, the cold, ruthless efficiency required to fight the monsters they told us were coming from the West. Our propaganda was a heavy, suffocating blanket, woven from necessity and pride. And it told us that the enemy, the Anglo-American terror bombers who turned our nights into a hellish symphony of light and concussion, were automatons. They were savage. They were uncultured. They were soulless profiteers driven only by greed. Incapable of mercy or art, they were everything we, in our desperate, cultured struggle, were not. The conveyor belt taught me discipline. It taught me that life was a relentless, repetitive cycle of input and output, and that feelings were an impediment to duty. That was my core metaphor, the foundation of my spirit. Keep your head down, keep the line moving, ensure the charges are true, and survival is assured. I measured loyalty in the exactness of my movements, my patriotism in the flawless delivery of destruction. But the war, the great, filthy beast of history, has no respect for clean lines or predictable consequences. It is a thing of contradiction, of mud and ash and misplaced humanity. It has been nearly 70 years. Yet the past is not a foreign country. It is merely a room tucked away behind a familiar door, and I find myself compelled to step back inside. And the key to that room, for me, is the sound of a train. Not the panicked shriek of an air raid siren, not the crunch of military boots on frozen gravel, but the deep, melancholic horn of a freight train far away, carrying nothing but grain or timber across a peaceful land. That sound of quiet, unburdened transit, is the signature of Camp Perry, Ohio. It comes back to me sometimes when the night is still and the world outside my window is finally resting. The low, resonant thrum carrying across the flat American fields, smelling not of smoke or the metallic tang of blood, but of damp earth and the sweet, almost sickly scent of clover, a scent so utterly, offensively peaceful that it was a violence all its own to my shell-shocked mind. I can feel the scratch of the rough, unpainted timber of the barracks wall against my back. I can feel the gnawing emptiness in my stomach that even the adequate, but tasteless, American rations could not quite fill. I can feel the brittle, defiant shell I built around my spirit beginning to crack, not under the force of brutality, but under the unbearable, crushing pressure of asterisk normalcy. It takes me back to that moment, that week, when the true meaning of the war, not the one on the radio, but the one written in the small, terrible kindness of a stranger, was finally pressed into my hands, heavy and cold as a spent shell casing. I step through that door now, and I am 22 again, a prisoner of war in a land I was taught to hate, wrestling with the most dangerous question of my life. The journey across the ocean had been a brutal, churning blur of nausea and cramped, cold fear. We arrived in Ohio, a battered, exhausted collection of civilian internees, expecting cages and curses. We expected the raw, animal hatred that our leaders assured us was the only language the enemy spoke. We had been prepared for the interrogator's blinding lamp, for the casual, dehumanizing cruelty that was the staple of wartime narrative, a direct mirror of the violence we ourselves had learned to accept as necessary. But what greeted us was the sky. It was an impossible, audacious blue. Wide, immense, and unscratched by smoke, not the perpetually choked concrete gray canvas of Dusseldorf. I remember standing on the dusty road outside the Camp Perry gates, my shoulders slumped with exhaustion, my eyes constantly scanning for the threat, the trap, the hidden wire. There was no bomb damage. No ruins, only these long, clean, uniform, unpainted wooden barracks stretching out under that impossibly wide, cerulean sky. The air itself was alien, smelling of freshly cut grass, a sweet, vivid smell I hadn't known existed since I was a child, before the rationing and the bombs turned everything to ash and cinder. This tranquility was a weapon. It was profoundly, deeply unsettling because it did not align with the script I had been given. Inside the barracks, the cots were simple but clean. There were actual sheets, thin but real, and the silence, only the rhythmic, distant clanging of that train, and the relentless, irritating chirping of crickets. Where was the chaos? Where was the terror? My mind, trained for years to register every vibration, every shadow as a potential death blow, was left screaming in an echo chamber of disbelief. I felt like a machine idling without instruction. Then came Sergeant Miller. I was sitting on the edge of my cot, still wrapped in the grim, tired defiance of a munitions worker, the shell loader who knew how to wait for the blast. He was a tall man, late 30s perhaps, with a face that looked tired, burdened by life, not cruel. His uniform was starched, but his eyes carried the weight of something that had already seen too much fighting to bother with hatred. He stopped at my cot. My muscles tightened, preparing for the inevitable interrogation, the sudden shift to violence. I kept my face blank. A wall of stone. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't even look directly at me for long, respecting some invisible boundary. He simply leaned down and placed something on the thin blanket beside my foot. A book. It was small, worn, bound in dark, scuffed leather. My eyes, conditioned to read schematics and explosive measurements, slowly registered the gold lettering on the spine. Goethe, Faust. He spoke, his German heavy, slow, and careful, his accent thick like wet sand, but undeniably German. Saw you eyeing the camp library. The camp library. The utter absurdity of a library, a quiet space for contemplation. For us, might make the time pass a little easier. Just try not to mark the pages, yeah. He gave a slight, tired nod and moved on, his gait professional and indifferent. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds. But in those 10 seconds, my universe tilted. It was the most devastating moment of my war. Not the bombs falling, not the near misses. Not the hunger, but the recognition. The simple, quiet, impossible act of a soldier, my designated enemy, a man who represented the destructive force that had annihilated my city, recognizing that I was not just a number. Not just a asterisk German asterisk, but a human being who might find solace in poetry. A shared cultural touchstone. A man who saw me, Greta Richter, the loader from the factory floor, and offered me a conversation with Goethe instead of a fist. The propaganda, the towering, ironclad structure of belief that had held me together through 5 years of hell cracked. Right there on the spine of that book. I was taught these men were barbarians, uncultured, bloodthirsty profiteers whose only aim was our total annihilation and enslavement. But barbarians do not read Goethe. Barbarians do not offer comfort to their prisoners. They do not share the literature of the enemy they despise. I didn't open the book for hours. I just stared at it, touching the cool, smooth leather, feeling the ghost of the American Guard's hand on the cover. It was a physical contradiction to my entire reality. I began to observe the guards differently, searching for the crack in their facade, the moment they would drop the act and reveal the monster beneath. But it never came. Their professionalism was consistent. They were strict, yes, upholding the rules of the camp, but never malicious. The food was bland, but consistent and sufficient, far better than the meager rations we received at home. There was no forced labor beyond simple camp maintenance. We were treated not as animals, not as slaves, but as highly inconvenient, temporarily detained people whose humanity had, against all expectations, been preserved. This was the true horror. The terror was not in their cruelty, but in their asterisk decency asterisk. Because if they were decent, if they were human, if their nation operated with this kind of quiet, systemic morality, then what did that make us? What had we been fighting for? The internal war was agonizing. I felt like a traitor every time I ate the warm, clean bread. Every time I saw a guard laugh easily with a fellow prisoner over a shared cigarette. My mind was a relentless battleground. They are only pretending, Greta. It is a trick. They want to lower your guard, they want information. They want you to betray the fatherland. But my eyes saw the weariness in Miller's face, not malice. My stomach felt the steady warmth of the soup, not the gnawing, familiar hunger of the besieged. I was struggling against my own survival instinct. To believe the enemy was human was to admit that my entire life's sacrifice, the death of my friends, the ruin of my country, was based on a monstrous, purposeful lie. Then came the chance. One night, a week after the book arrived, a group of women, the true believers, the fierce nationalists whose eyes still held the desperate, unquenched fire of duty, whispered their plans. A section of the perimeter fence, loosened by a recent spring storm, a temporary lapse in the patrol rotation that left a 10-minute window of darkness near the creek bed. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones of duty, of honor, of reaching a neutral country, of continuing the fight, of showing the world that German will was unbroken. My heart pounded a frantic, sharp rhythm, the same rhythm the press machine made just before the die came down. This was my test. Escape was my duty. If I stayed, I tacitly admitted defeat, the betrayal of my dead neighbors, the invalidation of every shell I had loaded. I would be confirming that the lie I had been fighting against was, in fact, the truth I had to embrace. I watched the clock on the barracks wall, listening to the crickets and the wind rustle the cornfields outside. The air smelled impossibly sweet and innocent. I looked at Faust sitting on my cot, the worn leather cool beneath my fingertips. Go the rights of the struggle for the soul, the desperate bargain between the high aspiration and the lowest impulse. The Faustian choice, the choice between the comforting darkness and the agonizing light. To run would be to preserve the lie. It would be to confirm the necessity of my hate, to justify the terrible sacrifices to keep the world simple. Us good, them evil. It would be to keep loading the shell of my ideology, even though I knew the casing was empty and the powder was damp. To stay was to choose the terrifying complexity of truth. It was to admit that the enemy had been misrepresented, which meant that the sacrifice of my people might have been in service of a terrible, unforgivable mistake. It was to let the propaganda, the protective shell, finally shatter and to face the raw, unshielded reality of what we had become. The minutes bled away. 5 minutes until the window. My breath caught in my throat. I heard the faint, furtive movements of the others slipping out the door, their steps soft, urgent, and heavy with the weight of old loyalty. I did not move. I gripped the small leather book, my knuckles white, and listened to the peaceful, insistent chirping of the American night. I chose the quiet, agonizing freedom of not running. I chose the truth, and it tasted like ash and fear and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The machine had stopped. The conveyor belt was still, and I was left, finally, with only myself, unburdened by the requirement to hate. The others were caught, of course, a few miles down the road, shivering and ashamed. They were returned without fanfare, without brutality, only with the same tired, professional detachment. That was the final, devastating lesson. Their system did not need cruelty to enforce its order. It needed only quiet persistence and a functioning set of morals. I stayed until the end of the war, a quiet, diligent prisoner. I learned English. I read every book in that little library, searching for an instruction manual on how to live in a world where everything you believed had been pulverized by a small, unexpected act of grace. The memory of Camp Perry is not a wound, but a scar, a place where the skin healed differently, permanently sensitized to the touch of deceit. It is the place where my second life began. I spent the rest of my working life, after I returned to a broken Dusseldorf, working not in a factory but as a bookbinder, repairing the pages of others' histories, others' poetry. I exchanged the cold, rhythmic clang of the shell press for the gentle, insistent asterisk thwack asterisk of the binder's hammer and the dry, papery scent of old wisdom. It was a trade of mending, not breaking. I still think of the conveyor belt, my core metaphor of precision, loading the shells, keeping the line moving, knowing the exact consequence of my actions. I realize now that the efficiency of the factory, the clean, measurable output, was the biggest lie of all. It convinced me that war was about technology and logistics. It convinced me that the human element was secondary, interchangeable, disposable. Sergeant Miller, that tired man with the gentle eyes, he proved that the human element is everything asterisk. That one small book, a piece of shared culture, a recognition of my soul, was the charge that blew up my entire world. It showed me that the most precise measurement of a nation is not the caliber of its artillery, but the kindness it extends to its captive enemy. The most damning evidence against a totalitarian regime is the simple, unearned courtesy shown by those it taught you to fear. That is the scar I carry, the knowledge that true strength lies not in the capacity to hate, but in the terrifying, vulnerable choice to acknowledge the shared humanity of your opponent. The hardest battle is the one fought in the silence of your own mind, against the comforting certainty of your own dogma. I never saw Miller again. I tried to find him years later through the Red Cross, but the records were vast and fragmented. It does not matter. He is fixed in my mind not as a hero, but as a simple man doing his job with a profound decency that transcended the uniform he wore and the uniform I wore. He was a temporary custodian of my freedom, and the permanent custodian of my truth. And that is the wisdom, the terrible, liberating truth I had to build my life upon. History is not a clean diagram of good versus evil. It is a tragedy, a muddy, confusing mess of good people on all sides, manipulated by the promise of simple answers and the fear of the other. We forget that the person opposite you, whether across a trench or a fence or a border, is fighting for their own version of home, their own fear, their own small piece of comfort. And often they are just as tired, just as frightened, and just as human as you are. The great danger is not in the strength of your enemy, but in the clarity of your own hatred. Hate is easy. It is a clean line, a simple calculation that justifies all necessary cruelty. But kindness is complicated. It demands you look closer. It demands you dismantle the protective lies you've built around your heart, brick by painful brick. I am finished now. The silence of the night has returned, but it is no longer the suffocating silence of memory, only the quiet expectation of the dawn. I put my hands together, these hands that once armed destruction, now mend stories, and I feel the familiar ache of age. I ask you this, then, as my final charge, my final instruction. When the world demands you draw a clean line between us and them, look not for the great battle, but for the small gesture. Look for the unexpected book. Look for the shared recognition in the eyes of the one you are taught to despise. That moment of shared sight, that is where the real war ends. And that is where the terrifying, beautiful work of being human begins. Go now, look closely, and choose the truth no matter how heavy it feels.